Hi everyone and welcome back to another 3D revolution. In this video I'm going to be showing you how to laser engrave and cut directly using Snapmaker's Luban software. Let's take a look. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is download and install Snapmaker Luban. If you haven't already got it, just head to snapmaker.com/snapmaker-luban and click on the blue download link. If you need it for a different operating system, just click the link at the bottom there. Otherwise, just click the blue button, download and install now. Okay, so once you've got Snapmaker Luban installed and opened up, this is the window you're going to come to. At the top here, you've got your different modules that you'll be using, which we'll look at in a second. And then on the right here, you've got Workspace, which is where you'll be able to control your Snapmaker machine connected to your computer via USB or Wi-Fi. The first module is 3D printing, if you're going to be doing that. The second is laser engraving. You get 3-axis or 4-axis options, which is determined by whether you're using the rotary module or not. The same options also come under CNC. Obviously, if you're using the rotary module, it's the 4-axis you'd be using. Down at the bottom here under case library is a bunch of pre-assigned projects for each of the modules so you can get to know the software and the process. So in this video we're looking at laser engraving with Luban, so we'll be going on to laser and we're not using the rotary module, so we'll select 3-axis. When setting up your laser project, the first thing you're going to be asked is job setup. So you've got your work size, which is effectively your build plate size. This will be determined by the machine. I'm using a Snapmaker A250T, which has a build plate of 230mm by 250mm. If you're using a different Snapmaker model, such as the original or the 350, you'll need to set this up based on your machine's build plate size. The other option under job setup is work origin. This affects how the coordinates play out in the machine instructions. I'd recommend just leaving this on center and clicking confirm. Okay, so here you've got the general Snapmaker Luban user interface. I'll take you through the different areas, but in essence this middle square here, this represents your build plate on which you can see the dimensions. As we selected the work origin at the center, you can see they go from minuses on the left and bottom to pluses on the right and top. Up at the top here, you've got the navigation tools. We'll look at them in a second. On the left, you have the design tools for creating the content to laser engrave on your workspace. And then on the right here, you have the edit features and processes when you've highlighted something that you've created on your build plate. Okay, so let's have a look at the navigation bar. The first option here is Home. This just takes you back to the window we were at a minute ago where you select your module head, whether it be 3D printing, laser or CNC. You then have Workspace. We're going to look at this more later on, but this is where you control your Snapmaker machine connected to your computer via USB or Wi-Fi. And this is where you're going to carry out the project that you've set out in the workspace here. You can save the project once you've imported or created something that you're going to design so you can edit it later on. And then you've got the back and redo options. Job setup is the window that we did a minute ago, which has your work size and work origin settings in there. This is something that you can edit later on in the project, and we will be looking at that again. Top and bottom I'll come back to later, as will I the camera capture mode. Let's now take a look at the toolbar on the left here. This is where you're going to create or import content that you're going to later engrave. The first option here is Import, where you can import images or vectors. Let's bring in our logo for a test. We'll talk about what it's done here in a minute and also cover the area on the right here, but that has now imported it. You can see the next option on the toolbar here is the pointer, which is the select tool. So if you have that selected, you can click and select different objects. If you click and drag, you can move them around. And if you hold down the right mouse button, you can move around the environment itself, like this. You can zoom in and out using the middle scroll wheel on your mouse or using the on-screen plus and minus buttons over here. The next tool is the pen tool, which allows you to draw shapes in your workspace. Once you've done that, you can either edit it via the points, or using the select tool you can delete it either in its entirety or point per point. After that, you've got the square tool, which allows you to just draw squares and rectangles, and then circles as well. After that, you've got the text tool, which allows you to enter text. If you click this once, it will create a text block saying Snapmaker in the middle of your workspace. Now, if you select it, so over on the right here, you've got a variety of settings based on the item that you've selected. We'll look at this more later, but you have the position under move, you have the size of the item, and then down here for text, you have the actual text content. If we select that, we can change it to 3D revolution. Underneath that, you have the options for font and size. So let's go ahead and change the font to something a bit more 3D rev. Now, when you've got more than one object in your workspace at a time, each one is on its own layer, either above or below the others. This can be edited quite easily. So if I move this over to the side here, you'll see on the bottom left is a list of the different objects. If I now click bottom with the text selected, you'll see that that layer has now been moved underneath the logo, and the logo can now obscure it. If I was to click top with the text selected, it brings it back on the top. Let's just place that underneath for now. The final tool is the ability to draw shapes in your workspace. Let's go back to the select tool. I'm going to show you over the settings again in a second. But first of all, what I'm planning on doing is engraving this logo and the text on a bit of wood and cutting it out. So what we need to do is create the cut line that it's going to follow. We'll move these out of the way for a minute. Next, what I'm going to do is use the square tool to create the cut line that's going to cut around both the logo and the text. I'll just draw a random square on the workspace for now, and then we can edit it in the settings. So I'll draw that there, go back to the select tool and select it. Up here, you've now got the settings relating to that square. So you've got the position, you've got the size, you've got the rotation axis, and then you can also flip it in two different axes. I'd like the final piece to be 50mm wide, so let's change the dimensions in W to 50. The next thing to do is to unlock the padlock. Now this keeps the aspect ratio locked. When you change the width, it will change the height relating to the original size. Now it's unlocked, I can change them independently without them changing each other. So let's change this to something along the lines of 70mm. Let's make that a bit shorter. Let's go for 60. Perfect. Okay, so the last thing to do here, I could obviously position it manually by lining up the dots with the lines, but I want this to be perfectly centered. So if I go up to the position under move, I can select 0 and 0. And if I click enter, that is now going to move it perfectly centered in the workspace. Now with the setup we have, the position is based on the center of the object and the center of the workspace. So with 0 and 0, the object is now perfectly centered in the middle of the workspace. So now we've got our line that we're going to use to cut around our workspace. The next thing I want to do is position and align the logo within this area we're going to cut. Obviously at the moment it's way too big, so we'll need to resize that. Over on the right here, you'll see we've got the same settings for this that we did when we selected the square. So let's go ahead and change the size. What you'll notice is that I need to leave the padlock locked this time because we don't want to distort the image when we're resizing it. Now I could resize it just by clicking and dragging one of the corners within the workspace like that. But because we know what size that we want this to be, the easiest thing is to just enter the size in the settings on the right hand side. As our cut space is 50mm wide, let's set this to 45mm wide. And now it is resized to 45 by 45. Next thing to do with the logo is to center it within our cut zone. So we could either drag and move it, or we can just go up and set it to 0. And then let's get it centered for now, 0 again, and that's centered within our cut space. We want it to move up slightly so it's not right in the middle, so let's change the Y position to 5, and there we go, it's moved up. That looks great. The next step is to move and resize the text, so let's just drag that so it's a bit more visible now. Now if we set the X position to 0, it's going to center it on the workspace, and we want to move it just down a bit so it's below the logo. Let's try minus 25, oh okay, up a little bit, minus 22.5, let's go. Great. So the last thing we need to do with the text is to resize it. We can obviously click and drag, we could change the font size, but because we know what area we're working with, we know roughly what size we want that to go down to. So let's make it the same size as the logo and make that 45mm again. There we go, that looks great. So let's take a look now at the other settings for the image. We've got here 4 different processing modes, which basically determine how it converts an image into a toolpath and how it's going to engrave it. The first one, black and white, basically determines whether an area is entirely black and engraved or white and not engraved. Grayscale is the perfect one for photos, as it allows, as the name suggests, a grayscale, a variant between the two, so you can have different shades. Vector is for vector shapes, and halftone is a bit of a different one, which isn't going to be right for most people. The best way to explain what each of these modes does is by showing you the impact of them on a photo. The logo hasn't got much detail in there, so it's not going to be a good example of what each of these does. But if I import a photo, then I can show you what that does. So let's import, there's a screenshot here of my Iron Man video from a while back. So if I take a look at this, I'll zoom in a bit. So black and white mode, if we select that, you can see that it is determined some areas are white and some areas are black. So in this, everything that's black would be engraved, everything that's white would not be engraved. It's all going to be either on or off effectively. You can then change the threshold to determine how strict it is in figuring out whether an area is light or dark, which can then affect the amount of the area which is being engraved. If you click invert, it's going to change the way it interprets that, so light areas become dark and vice versa. The next option along here is grayscale. So if I select that, like I said, this is the best one for photos. If you select grayscale, then you've got far more detail in the image here, with a gradient of shading and detail across the image. Underneath here, you've got a few different options. So you have contrast, which is how different the light and dark areas are. The higher the number, the sharper the edges will be between the light and the dark areas, and the less gradient you're going to get. You can see there it's a much sharper edge on that highlight. If I take that the opposite direction, then it's going to be much more of a grey image rather than white and black. So you ideally want this as close to the center as allows for a good quality image. The brightness is then also going to affect how bright the image is, which may also affect what you want from the contrast. So if we change the brightness slightly, you can see that big bright patch around my eye darkening down, and then you've got more detail in there. We could then up the contrast to increase the definition whilst that area is no longer blown out. And then adjusting the contrast so that not too much of my jacket and shirt are just solid black. There's still a bit of detail in there. White clip affects how bright light needs to be completely white. Finally, you've got the algorithm, which is the way it changes the image into an exact toolpath. It is how different detail will affect a different style of toolpath. So Atkinson is the standard one it goes to, and it is often the best, but it is worth having a play around with different images and different modes here to see which one is best for yours. As I said though, Atkinson is generally the best one to go with, so that's what I'm sticking with for now. Vector mode will at the moment look a bit similar to the black and white one, but this is designed for if you're importing a vector image, whether it is a vectorized image or you're importing vector text. This will mean that instead of trying to interpret the lines to follow, it will actually follow the vector lines, and you'll get a much cleaner edge to your engraving. It may also increase the speed for the toolpaths. Halftone, again, like I said, it's a bit different to your standard styles here, and whilst it's not going to work for a lot of projects, it's a useful one to be aware of, and you can get a different sort of look with it. So I'll just get rid of the image as we're going to focus on the logo for now, and let's zoom in and have a better look at it. If I select the image, then we'll be able to go back to the options over here. Obviously, I've got grayscale selected. At the moment, black and white would be a bit too bold for what I'm looking for, as there is a bit of shading around the outer edges there, a bit of drop shadow. If I change the contrast, it may become a bit more apparent. Maybe the brightness needs to come down a bit, maybe a bit less so. There we go. You can see a bit of the detail in the drop shadow around the edges of the object and the square there. Okay, so I'm happy with that. I think it's good to move on. The next stage would be to go and add the processes for this of what we would like to actually do with these items. But first I want to go and look at the camera capture mode. This mode is something that really sold the Snapmaker 2 to a lot of people, as it allows you to image the area that you're going to work on and line things up with it. I found that it's not always as accurate as I'd like it to be, and therefore haven't really been using it that much, because it's much easier to manually line something up and guarantee that it's going to be where you want it to be. Anyway, for now, let's get my material added to the Snapmaker and get it turned on so we can get ready for the camera capture. I'm just using a standard 3mm thick bit of plywood, which I'll now attach to my build platform using some fantastic 3D printed TPU mounts, which I'll pop in the description below. These things are really useful and much better than the ones that come with the Snapmaker. So now let's take a look at camera capture. If you hover over it, you can either add background or remove background. For now we want to add background, and then if you click start, the camera in the module head will move around to several different positions around your workspace to take photos, which will then stitch together and present to you here. If this has happened, like I said before, it's not always that reliable and the bed hasn't been centered and it seems to be missing some images, click confirm, remove background, and then add background again. See if it works this time for you. If it fails again, I click the calibrate button on the bottom of this camera capture window and follow the instructions there to see if that helps you. For now, this seems to have worked and it's at least showing the full piece of plywood that I'm going to be working on. If you did have an issue, this is where the calibrator button is, but otherwise just click confirm for now. You now have that photo added as a background and you can move your objects around to line up with them. However, as you've already seen, it's not always that reliable, and so I generally opt not to use this feature when I'm engraving. It can give you an idea while you're lining things up, but I wouldn't rely on it at the end of the day, so I will be removing it. That said, I just wanted to quickly show you that if you're using this feature and you're engraving via Luban, like this tutorial is, it can work okay. However, if you want to export the G-code or send the file to your device, using camera capture seems to force the work origin that we set earlier to the center to be at the bottom left. This changes the way that the coordinates work, and the Snapmaker machine, if you're working directly off the machine itself, doesn't recognize these coordinates and it can try and engrave off of the build plate. Whilst you have a background image, it only allows you to have this in bottom left, and the feature is locked, you can't change it. The only way that you can change this to work if you're exporting the file or sending to the device is to, once you've got it lined up, remove the background, then go into job setup and you can change that back to the center. This is obviously absolutely an issue with software and firmware, and hopefully Snapmaker will just sort it out in a future update. So before we click next to continue, what we need to do is explain to Luban what we want to do with each of our items, our logo, our text, and our cutting line. So let's start with the toolpath. If we select that here, go to Processes, select Create Toolpath, and then we come up with the Toolpath Settings menu. The first option here is Name. We can just change that so it's easily recognizable in the toolpath list. Let's change that to just Cutting Line for now. Now your settings are going to vary massively depending on what material you're working with and what you want to do on it, and also what laser module you've got, whether it's the 1.6 watt or the 10 watt. However, there are some really good presets assigned by Snapmaker under this menu. These presets are going to vary depending on whether you've got Luban set up for your 10 watt laser or your 1600 milliwatt laser, because there will be different settings for different materials. For now, what we're trying to do with this line is to cut through a 3mm piece of plywood, which has similar setting requirements to that of the basewood presets here. So let's select under the basewood options, we'll go with the cutting 3mm. The next option is method, where you get on the path option or the fill option. So this is whether you want to fill the entire area or just follow the outlines. We only want to follow the outline, we want to go on the path because this is our cutting line, so we'll select on the path. Under that we have jog speed. This is the speed that the workhead moves when it is not actively using the laser. Whilst it doesn't affect the engraving itself, you may want to change this to affect reliability. Underneath that you have work speed, which is the speed that the module head moves when it is actively using the laser. A higher number, and therefore quicker, will run across the objects more quickly. A smaller number, and therefore slower, will spend more time lasering on your material and will therefore either cut deeper, engrave more intently, or could potentially even set fire to it if it is running too slowly at a high power. I'm going to run at 270mm a minute for now because I've got experience with this material. Also, it's worth noting that this is millimeters a minute rather than millimeters a second that other software can use. Now the next option is number of passes. I'm using the 10-watt laser, and with the 10-watt laser cutting 3mm plywood at 270mm a minute, it's going to be no issue cutting this in one pass. But with the same bit of wood with a 1600mm laser module, you may need to do a number of passes. Effectively, a pass is a single go at trying to do the entire job you've told it to do. Let's say you wanted to try and cut through a 3mm bit of wood, but you could only cut through 1mm at a time. You would need to do that job 3 times, so you would have 3 passes. After it finishes the first pass, it would run that same job again, and then for a third pass again. If I change this to 2 passes, it will come up with another setting here, the Z step per pass. What this is after it's finished the first pass, it will move the head down on the Z-axis by the amount of distance you've set here. So if you're cutting 1mm down with each pass, you would want to move it down 1mm between each pass so it remains in focus on the material that you're cutting. As well as using multiple passes to cut through thicker material than you can cut in one go, you may also want to use it to allow the material to cool in between passes so you don't burn or scorch your material on a single pass at higher power. But for now I only need 1 pass. Finally, you've got the laser power. You may want to reduce this if it's either too powerful for your material or you're trying to run things a bit slower. But as I'm cutting a bit of wood that isn't going to catch fire at this speed, I'm going to use 100%. And click Save. And that's created our first toolpath. Let's select the image next and click to Create Toolpath again. And we'll rename this one to Image Logo, I think. So under presets, there are a few different engraving options. There is dot filled, line filled, and vector engraving. However, these are just presets and the actual settings are all below. The first one is method. We've got on the path and fill. For cutting, we use on the path, but as we want to use the detail in the content of the image, we want to select fill for this section. The next option is movement mode, either dot or the other alternative is line. So when using dots, you can kind of see here that it's a collection of different densities of dots. It's kind of like an old school newspaper where a collection of dots of different colors viewed from a certain distance looks like an image. It's a similar thing here. This allows a much higher level of detail than the line option, but can take a lot longer because the dot option requires the laser to remain on one dot for a designated amount of time, turn off the laser, move to a new location, turn on the laser for a designated amount of time, and so on. As a comparison, the line mode, which can draw lines either horizontally, vertically, or diagonally, just draws lines across the area of your image, turning the laser on and off as it passes over the areas it wants to engrave. This is much faster than dot engraving, but doesn't allow you quite as much detail. The final option under the fill section is fill interval, which is available both on the line and dot mode, and it determines the distance between the dots or the lines in the engraving, effectively how dense it will be engraving. The higher the density, and therefore the smaller the interval here, the darker and more engraved the image will be. If these lines are too close, then it could either overlap the engraving areas or scorch the material too badly. So you need to find an option that's good for your material. The best way to find the right settings for your material is to run a test grid. If you check out my profile, you'll find a video specifically on how to run test grids. So I'm going to set this to 0.1mm for now, which I think should be about right for this material that I'm using. The next option is jog speed, which, as with the cutting path, is just the speed that the laser module moves when the laser is not active, so we can leave that as it is. After that, it's dwell time, and this is the amount of time that the laser remains on each individual dot. So currently it's set at 5 milliseconds per dot, which I think is about right for what I'm wanting for this material, so I can leave that as is as well. And finally, there is laser power, which is currently set to 60%. And again, on this material, that should work for me, but you'll want to do a test grid to figure out the best settings for your material. And we can go ahead and click save. So finally, we will select the text and click create toolpath and change the name to text. This time, we're going to go with vector engraving. As the text was created directly in Luban, it is a vector file, so this would be the most efficient method for doing the engraving. However, as it's a thick font and we want it to be completely filled in, rather than choosing the on the path method that would be used by vector engraving, we're going to change that to fill, so we can have it as a solid black text. On the movement mode, we'll then get the option of both line and dot, but because it is just text and it is a nice simple shape, we'll stick with line to keep it nice and quick. And we can change the interval to 0.14 millimeters with horizontal lines because it is a long, thin shape. The jog speed we can remain the same, and the work speed is the speed of the tool head whilst it's actively engraving. And we can just click save. So the last thing I'd like to talk about before we click next is the order of the toolpaths. So in the toolpath list in the top right here, we've got the list of the 3 different jobs that we're going to be doing: the cutting line, the engraving of the image logo, and the engraving of the text. I'd really recommend that if you're doing a job like this where you want to engrave on a material and cut around the area you're working on, that you do the cut last, because once you cut out that area, that material could drop or shift slightly, which would mean that the engraving you're doing is going to be misaligned. So always do the cutting last if you can do that. Now, if you highlight one of these that you want to move and click the arrows down or up, it will move the order. The top of this list is going to be the first thing it does, and the bottom of the list is going to be the last thing it does. Also, the eyes to the right of each of those items, if you hide them, or if you don't create a process at all, they will be ignored when you go through to actually do the engraving. So now let's click Generate G-Code and Preview. This will generate a preview for you, and if you zoom in, you'll be able to see the exact toolpaths, the exact areas that it's going to engrave. If you remember correctly, with the image, the logo, we're going to be engraving using dots, and with the text, we're going to engrave using a series of horizontal lines that you can see here. So what you're looking at here, these dark areas are the areas that it's going to have the laser running over. That looks like it's going to come out okay to me, so I'm happy with that. Now you could click Close Preview and that will take you back to the settings menu if you wanted to make any changes, but otherwise it's time to export. So if you click the arrow next to export, you'll get the option to export G-code to file, which you do if you wanted to put this file onto a USB stick to then put into your machine later, or load G-code to Workspace for either running from Luban or sending the file to your device. So we're going to go ahead and do that. The first thing it's going to do here is automatically connect to your Snapmaker if you have one connected. If it doesn't do this, I'll show you how to do this in a minute. From here, you can start the job. By clicking on the arrow, you can either start on Luban or send it directly to the device and save it to internal memory. For now, we'll click cancel because we can do this manually later. So if you didn't connect to your Snapmaker and it's not showing up here, this is what you'll probably have on screen. You can connect either via USB or Wi-Fi there. So if it's not showing up, the first thing to do is to click on the refresh icon just to the right of the name. Once you've refreshed it, it should just appear in the drop-down menu there. But if it hasn't worked, you can click the plus button over here and enter the IP address of your Snapmaker machine and click confirm. Selecting the Auto Connect button before clicking Connect will make sure that it automatically connects to your machine next time you're in the Workspace. If this is the first time you've connected Luban to your Snapmaker, it may ask for you to confirm the connection on the touchscreen of the device before continuing. Okay, so here is the Luban Workspace user interface. Over on the top left here, you've got confirmation of the module that you've currently got attached. I've currently got the 10 watt laser module attached, but even if you've got the 1600 milliwatt, this entire process is exactly the same. You'll just be using different settings for your laser, but you would be doing that for other materials anyway. And as I have the Snapmaker enclosure attached, I also get the options to control the LED light strips within the enclosure, the exhaust fan, and also the door detection, which will pause the project when the door opens whilst it's running and then play again when the door closes. Up here you've got all the G-code project files that you've brought through to your workspace, and you can either send them to your device, start them here, upload or download them. Down here you've got the controls. So the first bit on the left is the machine coordinates, which is the relevant position of the 3 axes on the machine. The second part is the work coordinates. These were always referencing your work origin point, which you'll be setting in a minute. So the home button will home all 3 axes to their 0 position. It's always good to do this at the beginning of a job to make sure everything's lined up correctly. So there's 3 options down here, the first of which is run boundary. If you click this, it will, based on your current work origin point, draw a line around the outside of the boundary of the area that you're going to be working on. So regardless of what you're engraving or cutting, whether it's a circle or another shape, it will always draw a square of the outer boundary showing that all of your engraving and cutting will be within that space. This won't be a cutting line, it will just be a visible dot that you can follow to see where it's going to be cutting and engraving. The Go to Work Origin button simply moves the toolhead to be over the work origin that you have set. The work origin is the center point or the start point of your project. If you remember correctly before in the job settings, we set it to be the center. So the center of the area you want to engrave should be set with the work origin. To do that, pop on your laser safety goggles, turn on laser power, and that will turn on a low-powered non-engraving laser. From there, use the different length increments of 10mm, 1mm, 0.1 or 0.05mm, and use the different axes to move your laser module head to the location you would like to use as your laser work origin point. Then simply click Set Work Origin. From here, you can click Run Boundary, and that will automatically show you the outline of the boundary area that your engraving will happen. At the end of the run boundary, it will return to the origin point. If you were to be running this project locally on the machine itself and not running through Luban, you can do all of this via the touchscreen. Okay, so this is the file that we've just brought through. It always puts the latest one at the top. So what we're going to do is click Start on Luban, and it comes up with our focus option. So it defaults to auto mode, where it will project a red dot in the center of your workspace, and it will move the laser module up and down the Z-axis until that red dot is perfectly in focus. The alternative is to untick auto mode, and when you click next, you'll go through to manual focusing. For this, you need to move the module down until the end of your laser is just touching the material. When you confirm, the module will move up on the Z-axis a certain distance based on when you initially calibrated your laser module, and then it will be in focus. For now, we're just going to stick with auto mode and click Start. At this point, it will start loading the G-code and then begin focusing your laser. Once your laser is fully focused, it will begin the job, as we've already assigned the work origin and have now focused the laser. It can be very fun to watch the laser in progress, but it's also very dangerous. At the very least, use laser safety goggles and or an enclosure. I've got a couple of webcams that I've got set up in my enclosure, which I use for monitoring it remotely, so I never have direct line of eyesight with the laser. This is much safer and means I can monitor the job even when I'm not in the room. And so now our job is done. Time to take a look and see how it came out. If you look close enough, you can really see the detail of the exact toolpaths the laser used. Unfortunately, I used too strong a power on the text, so it burned all the way through the wood, but other than that, it's great. Well, other than obviously having too high a power for the engravement on the letters, I think that went really well. And I really hope this video has given you a good understanding of the basics for using Snapmaker Luban for laser engraving and cutting. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.